The Most Important People in the World, with Charles Berman and Jonathan Berman. Featuring interviews with people with interesting viewpoints, which, if true, could make them the most important people in the world. Let's meet one of them now.
All right, welcome to the Most Important People in the World podcast. Back again this week. I am Charles Berman.
And I am Jonathan Berman.
Thank you for listening. And our guest this week is Laura Johnston Kohl, the author of Jonestown Survivor, An Insider's Look. Thanks very much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So maybe we can just introduce to the listeners the background of in a capsule way, the background of Jonestown for those who might not even be very familiar. You, how you got involved and where it's taken you since, and what the book, sort of capsule of the book.
Okay. I want to make sure everybody knows that it's a very complicated subject. Mm-hmm. And so what we're doing today is simplifying it, but there's a lot of information around. So we won't cover everything because we don't have time in our lives right now to do it. But there's a lot more information that I'm going to share today.
And that's why there is a book.
I think there's a lot of
exactly right.
factual information that's available. But what I think is interesting about talking to a survivor is, when we hear about something like the events at Jonestown, it's really easy for us to think, oh, well, I'm too smart, I'm too savvy, that wouldn't happen to me, or I'm special, that wouldn't happen to me. But I honestly believe that most of us might in our lives be vulnerable, and it would be interesting to hear a little bit about personally what happened to you and your involvement with the People's Temple.
Well, I think that one of the most astounding things about being involved in People's Temple and knowing Jim Jones is that they were some of the smartest people I've ever met. And I mean, I've lived a long life now, and I've met many brilliant people over these many years. And certainly in People's Temple, some of the smartest people I ever met were people who somehow were sucked into believing in Jim Jones and thinking that, it was possible to have the dream that he talked to us about and tried to inspire. So that's certainly something that is just amazing to me, that, such smart people could be won over so seemingly easily. But so I'll just explain a little bit about who I was. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I was in middle school and high school in the 60s. And in the 1960s, it was the most difficult and violent political scene that you can imagine in these United States. I mean, within the decade of the 1960s, John Kennedy was shot and killed, Bobby Kennedy was shot and killed, Malcolm X was shot and killed, Martin Luther King was shot and killed, and Medgar Evers was killed in the South, among many, many, many other wonderful and idealistic leaders who certainly would have made a big difference in our country. So in that decade, when I was in a way in my most formative years of, middle school and high school and going off to college, I saw all of my heroes shot down as if the country had turned into vigilantism. And so that had a very profound effect on me, because I did not want to be in a world that was run by bullies, and I didn't want to be in a country that was run by bullies. And then at the end of the 1960s, we were involved in Vietnam. And so there was another, crisis that I didn't agree with. And when I protested against the war in Vietnam, I got tear gassed walking down Fifth Avenue in New York. So I had these experiences in the 1960s that I couldn't overlook. They were things that changed me forever. And one part of it was that the activism that I had grown up with because my mother was an activist. But as I saw these things happen in my lifetime, it really motivated me to try and do something about the desperate situation I saw in the world around me. So that's when I left Washington. I went to college in Connecticut. I dropped out of college. I briefly got married. I had Black Panthers move in with me, and we had the meetings in my kitchen as we discussed politics and what activities we were going to do. And then that didn't work out for me. I tried Woodstock to see if maybe that was the venue that I'd be comfortable in, and really that didn't fit at all. And about that time, my sister said, she lived in the Haight-Ashbury of San Francisco, and she said, you've made these, for about 4 years, you've made these lousy decisions as you spiral down, and so now it's time for you to move to San Francisco. So in March of 1970, I moved to San Francisco, and she was a lot involved in the legal field, and so she had talked to her attorney friends and different people, and they had told her about Jim Jones, who had a really rich, multi-ethnic, socio-economic message in Redwood Valley, 2 hours north of San Francisco. And so it was totally integrated. They were really smart, wonderful people. And Jim Jones was, to me, kind of a protector. I wanted to be an activist. And it seemed that not only was he articulate and vocal about my same issues, but he would be a protector so I wouldn't make the same decisions or, fall in the same deep holes I had fallen into as I was looking for a place to survive.
A lot of people, I think, could look at that and look back at some of the ideology that was there and see why that was appealing. And now, in the present time, you talk a lot about. You give speeches about some movements that could be seen as dangerous. How do you tell people that it's good to look at an ideology like this and determine, is this something that could be dangerous? Is this something that needs to be avoided? How can a person look at that and distinguish it?
Well, one of the very basic things I tell people is you can never turn off your critical thinking. Because what happened with me, I joined People's Temple, and I had kind of a difficult 3 or 4 years even before I joined in at 22. And so when I joined, I really felt like I looked at everything carefully for about 2 years. And then after 2 years, I was convinced, and I stopped thinking about, why did that happen? I don't understand this. I didn't think that was a good idea. I turned off that part of me that would question and look deeper into things. And I was so comfortable and I was so personally delighted that it really did seem like I didn't have to always be cynical and checking things out. And looking back, of course, that's never true. Things are never so good that you can stop wondering about them, asking questions, confronting things that are wrong. Things are never so good that you can just give everything a pass. And so, that was a horrible lesson that I learned and all of us learned, that you can't, if something's good one moment, you could believe that. But on an ongoing basis, you need to continually check back. In a way, just like we check back on our financial status, we check back on my library books being due. There's not anything that once you admit or agree to it, you never check in again. Mm-hmm. So I was just living in a fantasy world that, of course, things were going to continue and be wonderful, and I didn't have to watch it. And so I think Jim Jones really loved that people came, they bought into the whole image and the whole message, and then they just followed him blindly like I did. And so, I think that was a big part of the problem.
You said that you were looking, it seemed because of your experiences, it was appealing to you to find someone who would help you make decisions. Do you think that that there are people or a time in life when people are especially vulnerable to turning off their critical thinking?
I think that not only that, but I think that was a time in history where there were a lot of people who were idealistic who did not see that the current system, or that the system in 1970 or 1968, they didn't see that system taking on the challenge of getting rid of the racism in our country and getting rid of, the kind of vigilantism that went on in the 60s. So there are many people who were idealistic, and they thought, and we thought, that we had to get involved in changing the world, and we were looking for someone who could lead us in that direction. And, Jim Jones was multifaceted to the public. His public persona, was so impressive. He had these wonderful children. His wife was lovely. He had this integrated group that, was completely harmonious. He had people of all education levels, from doctors and lawyers down to people who were illiterate, and they were all treated equally in People's Temple. Children were taken care of. Many of the children wanted to be adopted by him, and so they changed their own names to Jones as their last name. So in many ways, he was it was very alluring to move into a place where he was kind of the dad of everybody. And I had been through a lot. And so having somebody as kind of a protector, not necessarily running interference, but somebody who would kind of watch out. And really early on in People's Temple, he did watch out for me. There were times when I was making a lousy decision. At one point, I had a relationship with someone else in the temple, and he had another girlfriend in San Francisco. And so he would visit me in Redwood Valley and then go back to his girlfriend in San Francisco. And, Jim just addressed that. He brought it up publicly and said, okay, make a choice. It's not going to work this way. I'm not going to have you do that with Laura and with your, girlfriend in San Francisco. So you need to move on this. And so in a way, his position was as a mediator and as someone who was overseeing what was going on. And particularly when I joined, when he was still living in the rural part of Northern California, he did have more hands-on in some of those different, the relationships going on. Once he got, in a way, addicted to the power of being in San Francisco, and, he met with Jimmy Carter's wife when she came to town. He was a bigwig and part of the power broker system in San Francisco. Once he took that on, he really moved beyond the level of relationships and moved into figuring out how to accumulate power. And so he was a genius at that. And so he moved right ahead with that. But many of us who first joined in Redwood Valley, in a way, we had that relationship with him before he became so power-oriented. And so we kind of rested our allegiance to him based on what we knew of him when we lived in the same community and saw him every day. And so that's why it was so hard to change. Once he moved to San Francisco, once he got, this public acclaim and more people worshiping him and more people joining and, putting money in the bank for him, once all that started, it was really the beginning of his decline.
Do you think that he really sincerely believed all the claims that he made and all the things that he taught? And beyond that, do you think that most leaders of groups like that really believe these things, or are they trying to be deceptive?
Well, I know that he definitely believed in total integration, because he and his wife were the first white couple to adopt a black child in the state of Indiana. And so, I know that there was pressure not to do that from his religious friends and other people. And really, he was not going to stop what he knew was right. So early on, he certainly had principles of getting rid of racism, kind of being the cutting edge of moving forward, not allowing things to just fester or stay as they were. So early on, I do believe that he was I believe he was an activist always. And I think that he was trying to figure out his best route to get to where he wanted to go, which was someone with power who could make changes. So I don't think that the part of him that was mentally unbalanced was so evident early on. I think that he's always a conniver or always a con man. I really do think that he probably wasn't religious, but he thought religion was a good way for him to have power and have people, drawn around him. I think as a child, he did go around checking out churches to see what church might fit him. And when he saw ministers in big churches up in the front and everybody was, quietly listening to everything the minister said and mesmerized by the message, he thought that was a job he wanted. And so that's when he started going into the ministry. He was not somebody ever who talked about the Bible as if, he knew all about the Bible. He read it backwards and forwards. He was very bright. He memorized what he needed to. But he was not a man of God. He was a man who, shared that message as a means to the end.
Well, there's a long history. You're going back to the time when Paul was ministering, of people getting different messages from Christian scripture, and I think in Corinthians he's writing about other apostles was the term they used, who at the same time were competing with Paul. So there's a kind of a long tradition of people kind of using the Bible to their end, and for the most part, it seems like even if I'm sure even in the population of ministers that are out there now, there are some who aren't genuinely religious who enjoy having a group of people who listen to what they say. How do you tell, the most of them are harmless, don't go on to do the things that Jim Jones did. How do you tell someone who is a legitimate believer or a legitimate leader from someone who is maybe not even unbalanced, but in it because they want to feel like they can influence people?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think that there's a certain personality type that is drawn to being a leader, whether it's a leader in politics, a leader in, a religious entity or a religious setting, or if it's somebody in, some other political or social persuasion. So, I mean, I think that there are people drawn to that position. So, and Jim was certainly one of those. And, I agree with you that many people are drawn to lead, and they just try and find the venue that's the least offensive for who they are personally. But I think that with Jim, there are a couple flags that came up that we really didn't see. And one was that there was no way to question anything he did. There was no format or setting where you could say, I don't understand why you did this because it doesn't make sense to me. He was always above being questioned. And so anytime, I think that, he had his own group of mistresses and secretaries who were compromised. And so they were not able to directly ask him things or, even reflect on things very easily. So he had people around him who had this code of silence, and they would not let what was going on in his inner circle out into the public or even the close groups that were outside of that. So for him to live in a life that was so full of secrecy, in a way that's a sign. But other things, that he would like to have everybody secluded, that he, picked Guyana. He had been in Guyana in the 1960s, and that he would pick such a remote spot, 24 hours by boat from Georgetown, which is the capital of Guyana. So here you have a country that nobody can find on a map. Most people ask me if it's in Africa. So there's this country, and then within the country there's a capital that, many people have not heard of. And then from the capital, 24 hours by boat, is Jonestown. That anything would be set up in that remote location, it's automatically an issue. And that Jim would ask people to give up their blood families and keep just the adopted family of People's Temple. When, looking back, I know with my myself, my son is adopted, and I am happy that he has his birth parents and he has us. You can't have too much love. You can't have too many family members and people who love and are concerned for you. So somehow we wanted to alienate the members of People's Temple from their families that they lived with and who, would take care of them and look out for them. And so I think that is another sign that if you have a leader who thinks he should alienate you from your support system, that should be another flag. Nobody should tell you which relatives you should have relationships with. That's totally your choice. And so for somebody to take that on, that's too much power for somebody other than you to have over your life.
That's very true. And now I know with while we do this interview, a lot of people are going to be wondering, and I'm sure this is covered in the book, but how is it that you avoided the mass suicide in Jonestown, and B, what kind of reaction you might have had when you found out about it? I'm sure that took a long time to process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So just a little bit about my story. So I moved to California in March of 1970. I started attending the temple around that time, but I wasn't so convinced that I wanted to move in yet. But after 3 or 4 months, I started becoming a regular member. I moved to Redwood Valley in August of 1970, and I started working at the welfare department there. I got very involved in all aspects of the church. And within the first 2 years, I was on the Planning Commission, which was a group that Jim gathered. It was kind of a combination group. It was people who were really hard workers, but certainly not all the hard workers. It was people that Jim wanted to watch. It was people who were married to hard workers. It was people, relationships that he might want to engage in. So he wanted to draw the young, beautiful white women into that. So it was this kind of a strange group of about 60 to begin with, and then closer to 90 or 100 people who would meet on a weekly or biweekly basis, or, have meetings every week or 2 weeks all night. And we would discuss all the business that was going on in the temple and what we wanted to do. And then, Jim would kind of use that to figure out the next path. So I got very involved in this circle, although it wasn't the inner circle, because within that group was this group of maybe 10 mistresses and secretaries who were his inner circle. And that included men and women, and he had sex with both men and women over the years with different members. So I was part of this planning commission. And in December of 1975, Jim took the whole planning commission to Guyana, and we took a look at it. I personally was totally enthralled by everything I saw. I loved living in the tropics. I loved the people of Guyana, who were just awesome and wonderful. And so we started building a community in Guyana so that we could raise kids away from the drugs that were on the street and big cities, and so we could have, a better chance to have a utopian community. So that happened in about 1974. We started building it. And in March of 1977, I moved to Guyana, and my job was to meet people at the airport, take them to the house in Georgetown, get them their residency rights. I'd buy all the supplies for Jonestown, all the machinery that broke down. I'd replace those parts. So my job was kind of on a sales team. I was called a procurer. And so I would, buy everything that was needed, ship it into Jonestown. And when I got there, there were about 40 people there. And by a year and a half later, there were 1,000 people living in the middle of the rainforest. So 1,000 people were eating 3 meals a day. So that was built from 40 people to 1,000 people in less than 2 years. So I lived in Georgetown, and during this time, we were all just working day and night, 7 days a week. So I lived in Georgetown. I moved into Jonestown in about March of 1978. And in Jonestown, I worked on an agricultural crew. I taught the kids Spanish, and I worked in the law office. And at that time, about a third of the people were under 18, about a third were 60 and over, and then there was a third that were kind of the hard workers who did the field work and a lot of the other work around the community. So of the 1,000 people, we were roughly split into thirds. And so I moved into Jonestown and I stayed there. Those of us in the community were kept busy, and we had meetings at night, we had classes for kids, we had literacy training, we had movies, we had all these activities, and so we were kept busy. During that time, Jim had a group of about 30 or more people who knew more about what was going on in San Francisco. Jim moved down to Guyana in 1977, and he was pretty much under house arrest in Jonestown because there were 9 custody cases of children who were in Jonestown, and there didn't appear to be proper legal authorization for them to be taken out of the country. They were either there was a parent who would bring a child but didn't have the other parent involved in the decision or whatever. So while the Guyanese government was working out the details, they told Jim that he should probably lay low and stay mostly in Jonestown. So here's this man who had thousands of people come to meetings, 3 or 4 times a week in San Francisco and Los Angeles. The same guy who, met Rosalind Carter and who is a very powerful in San Francisco with the mayor and the governor and the chief of police. And here he was, relegated really to this remote part of the country where we were all farm workers. I mean, we were building everything from scratch, whether it was roads, planting trees, houses, everything. So part of his, I think, depression came that here he had this inflated ego at that time and power, and he ended up kind of on house arrest in this farm workers community. And at the same time we were all there, in San Francisco, Marshall Kilduff and the New West magazine decided that they were going to investigate Jim Jones. They said, who is this guy who took 1,000 people to Guyana? Who is he? Why don't we know anything about him? He's never been elected in politics, and yet he has all this power with the local politicians. He's seen in every important spot. People who come to town speak to him as if he's some big, powerful guy. Who is he? And they started an investigation and started uncovering that some of the things that he did to create power or to grasp power along the way were not so good. And for one thing, he had been involved in a sting operation in Los Angeles. And so he had been busted in a bathroom when he approached a undercover police person, and all of that had been swept under the rug. And then in San Francisco, he had a number of different adventures and people who had left the temple who felt threatened. And there was a group in San Francisco in the Bay Area called Concerned Relatives, and they felt that their relatives were being held in Guyana against their will, and they wanted someone to investigate that. And then several people who were high up in the organization left People's Temple that same year in May and again in September. So they had all these people to interview and all kind of full disclosure on some of the behind-the-scenes activities. So that was going on, too. And finally, Congressman Leo Ryan from San Mateo said, I have all these people in Guyana. He knew some of the family members, and he had talked to the concerned relatives. And so Congressman Ryan decided he was going to go to Guyana. So he let Jim know that he was going to come down, and Jim said, absolutely not. You're not coming. And Congressman Ryan just persisted and said, I am coming. These are American citizens, and so I need to make sure that they're in safe hands. And so they had a battle, and Congressman Ryan won, and Jim had to allow him to come. So all of this was going on behind the scenes, but most of us who lived in Jonestown and lived in Guyana did not know all the details of this battle going on with Jim and Congressman Ryan. At the end of October of 1978, Jim sent me back into Georgetown to take up my old job. He told me anyway, that he wanted me to exchange so that some people who were in Georgetown could come out and see their family members and their loved ones. So he sent me to Georgetown about the same time that Congressman Ryan came into Guyana. So when I was at the Georgetown house, Congressman Ryan came to the house and climbed over the back fence and came and shook hands with all of us living in the house. There were about 50 of us. The basketball team, the Jonestown basketball team was there for a competition. And, there were a lot of people who did a lot of work in the house and people who had medical exams and who had dentist appointments and all different kinds of things brought people into Georgetown. So there were about 50 of us in Georgetown, and Congressman Ryan came into the house and asked how we were, and we assured him we were all fine. And then the next day or so, he wanted to go out to Jonestown. So he eventually got to Jonestown, and Jim had this enormous show with all the talented people who were part of People's Temple. And after it was over, Congressman Ryan, we've seen in videos that Congressman Ryan said, I can see that there are many of you who love living in Jonestown. And what you've done is really marvelous, that you would build housing for 1,000 people in less than 2 years. It's just amazing. And then when Congressman Ryan stepped off the stage, people started passing him notes saying, Jim won't let me leave. If he says he'll let us leave next week, don't believe him. We need to go with you tomorrow. So it ended up with about 20 people from the community all ready to go with Congressman Ryan the next day. And, Jim was one of those people that part of his insanity was that he took everything so personally. So rather than say, okay, this person wanted to live in a big city, he would make it feel like he had been forsaken, he had been abandoned by this person. And so here's Jim who, was more and more addicted to drugs, who was more and more adrift because he didn't have his power base, and who was distraught that he was physically ill as well, and he was not going to ever turn over his power position to somebody else. Like, he was never going to share that he had brought 1,000 people to Guyana. He was never going to share that with somebody else, that power or that, making somebody else famous. He wanted it all, fame or infamy, he wanted it. So when Congressman Ryan left with the people, Jim sent a truckload of people with guns to the airstrip to kill Congressman Ryan and kill, many of the people who were leaving and people in Congressman Ryan's entourage. And while they were gone, he drew everybody into the pavilion in the middle of Jonestown. So 900 and more people into the pavilion. And he said, you know what? We are killing a congressman. He never said, I am, never took ownership that he had planned it. He said, we have conspired to kill a congressman. He's being killed while we're here. Your lives will never be the same. You can never go back. You've given me your money. You've given me your houses. Your family won't have anything to do with you because you abandoned them. You're felons or you're co-conspirators to kill a U.S. congressman. So your lives will never be the same. And so he coerced these exhausted people, for several hours. And then at the end, his secretaries and mistresses went through the outside of this group where the children were and started giving the children poison. So the children were dying. And that meant that the adults who were trying to reason what was going on, it made them so that there was no choice. At that point, they couldn't imagine living their lives because their children, who were 20 or 30 feet away from them, were already dying and dead. And so in that way, Jim just, eliminated any further discussion and said, you know what? The only choice we have is revolutionary suicide. So he just coerced the people and then took the decision out of their hands with the children. So that was all happening in Jonestown. And while that was happening, Jim sent a coded message into Georgetown where I was. And he talked to one of his secretaries there and told her, everybody who's dying in Jonestown, it's time for everyone in Georgetown and San Francisco and Los Angeles to take their own lives. And so the woman who took the message in Georgetown sent me across town to get Jim's sons, who were on the basketball team, I brought them back, and they met in kind of a quiet room upstairs while the rest of the 50 people in the house were going about our business. And she told them that Jim said it was time to commit suicide. And Jim's 19-year-old son, Stephen, said, I want to get to Jonestown. I'm going to stop it. But, there was no way to get to Jonestown at that stage. It was already too late. But he said, we're not doing it. We're not following the instruction. It's all over. We are not doing it. It's done. We're not doing anything. And then he got on the phone to call San Francisco and LA to tell them, it's all over. We're not doing it. Don't follow the instruction. So he literally stopped anybody else from getting that instruction and killing themselves. So in the house in Georgetown, the woman who took the message did kill her 3 children and herself. But they were the only ones in Georgetown who killed themselves. And the rest of us didn't even know about it. When we came back, because we all had events we were going to that night, and this conversation was private, when we came back from our talent shows and different things, the Guyanese police were there, and they said everything had happened in Jonestown, and they were there to protect us. And really, we were just completely stunned and traumatized and just could not believe any of it.
Well, that's a very powerful story, and I want to thank you for sharing that with us.
And I think the people listening have to kind of understand this is everyone you knew, literally hundreds of people. It must have been incredibly difficult to live through that.
Yeah, it was near as close to impossible as it could possibly be, because those are the people I had chosen to spend the rest of my life with. I had no thought that I would ever come back to the United States. There was, I loved Guyana and I loved Jonestown. I felt that anything that was that I wasn't quite happy with in Jonestown, it would all be remedied when we could slow down and we weren't building, yet another cottage and feeding another mouth. That I really felt that everything was workable and that things were going to work out fine, whatever we had to work through. But, I think one of the most important things to understand is that before this happened in Jonestown, there had never been a mass killing by a so-called, or, at least we thought, benevolent leader ever in the United States history in my lifetime. There was never a precedent set. Like now, if somebody joins a cult, you say, just always think about Jim Jones, never let your guard down. But when we were in Jonestown and we were living in this community where, really, I did love it. We were living in this community. There was never something before that could alert you that actually he could be so mentally unbalanced that he would kill people. You know what I mean? It wasn't even just denial. There was no precedent. There was no history of that kind of thing happening. So it wasn't an option. We say either it's going to work or it's not going to work. If it works, we're there. If it doesn't work, we'll just go back to the United States. That's kind of our thinking. It never occurred to us that in any way that we were going to die in Jonestown.
So if there were a final or a summary message that you would like to give to the listeners before we tell them where to buy your book, what would that be?
I'd say that things are never so good that you can shut down that part of you that questions everything, and that life can be good, and that what you do can make a huge difference, but you can't confuse a moment of happiness with, okay, I'm going to never check in again to see if what I think is happening is happening. You can never be too careful. You have to see the leader. You have to continue to watch what's going on around you because you're in charge. No one's in charge of you but you. If you're not watching out for yourself, and you're not watching out for what's going on around you, there's not anybody else who has you as the priority. So you have to do it.
Well, thank you very much. I think that's a great message. And the book, once again, it's called Jonestown Survivor, An Insider's Look.
Right, and it's on Amazon, and I have it in an audiobook and a digital book and on Kindle, and so you can get it that way if you want a signed copy, or if you want to check out my website, it's jonestownsurvivor.com. So, and I love questions. If there's a question I didn't answer, I always answer every question. So you can reach me through my, through my website, and I'd be delighted to talk to you.
All right. And if you, speaking of questions, have questions for us, the email is the@mostimportantpeopleinthe.world. And I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope you got a lot out of the program, and I want to thank you very much for coming on the program with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Oh, and I think we ended the show with Visualize sending us money.
That's right. Yep, keep visualizing everything. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
You've been listening to The Most Important People in the World. With feedback or guest ideas, contact us at mostimportantpeopleintheworld@gmail.com.